On August 8, 2026, three leaders sat down together in Mecca: Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. They signed what's being called the Mecca Joint Defense Agreement, and its core clause borrows its structure directly from Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Any armed attack against one of the three states will be regarded as an attack against all three. Within hours, the phrase Islamic NATO was everywhere in regional coverage. Turkish officials moved quickly to soften the framing, insisting the pact wasn't aimed at any particular country. Pakistan's foreign ministry confirmed other states could eventually join. India's government said it was closely following the implications. None of that changes what actually just happened. Three of the most militarily consequential Muslim-majority states in the world, one with the region's largest defense industrial base, one with the deepest oil wealth, and one with nuclear weapons, just built a mutual defense structure that doesn't include the United States, in the middle of an active regional war America is fighting. This agreement didn't come from nowhere. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan had already signed a bilateral strategic mutual defense agreement back in September 2025, explicitly modeled on NATO's collective security logic, in the immediate aftermath of an Israeli strike on Qatar that rattled the entire Gulf. Turkey had been in talks to join that framework since at least January 2026, with Turkish media reporting explicitly that Ankara viewed the move as insurance amid questions over U.S. reliability, a direct, on-the-record acknowledgement that this wasn't only about Iran. By the time the trilateral version was signed in Mecca in August, the Gulf had spent 5 months absorbing the costs of a war launched by Washington and Tel Aviv that regional governments were not meaningfully consulted on. That's the context that matters more than any single clause in the new pact. American security guarantees have looked, from the perspective of the states most exposed to Iranian retaliation, less reliable with each month this war has continued. That perception has real evidence behind it, and it goes beyond battlefield anxiety. It shows up directly in the hardware. Independent reporting through the summer, including detailed accounting from CSIS, has tracked significant depletion of the American Patriot and THAAD interceptor stockpiles that Gulf states and Israel rely on for missile defense against exactly the kind of Iranian drone and missile fire this war has produced. Whatever the precise percentage, and the Pentagon has disputed the more dramatic figures reported by CNN and Reuters, while independent analysts have offered somewhat more conservative but still significant numbers, the underlying trend is not seriously contested. Months of sustained combat have drawn down interceptor inventories faster than they can be replaced, and replacement, according to CSIS's own assessment, is likely to take years rather than months. A Gulf government watching that trend line has a rational reason to start building redundancy into its own security architecture, rather than treating American protection as a fixed, permanent guarantee. The same pattern of hedging shows up on the other side of this war's map, in a very different form. Back in March, within weeks of the war's outbreak, Trump began publicly pressing European governments to send warships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz, framing it as a test of alliance solidarity, and at one point, warning NATO members of a very bad future if they declined to help. The European response was a coordinated, unambiguous no. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas told reporters after a ministers' meeting in Brussels that there was no appetite to expand the bloc's existing Aspides naval mission, built for the Red Sea, against Houthi attacks, to cover the Strait of Hormuz as well. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the UK would defend itself and its allies, but would not be drawn into the wider war. Germany's defense minister was blunter still. This is not our war. Kallas's own reasoning was telling. She noted that the strait's closure and the resulting spike in oil prices were, in her words, benefiting Russia's war against Ukraine, a war Europe considers far more directly its own. Japan, Australia, and the UK all separately confirmed they had no plans to contribute ships either. This wasn't one European government going its own way. It was a coordinated Allied refusal, delivered within 3 weeks of the war's start, and it has held since. Put the Mecca Pact and the European refusal side by side, and a pattern comes into focus that's easy to miss when each story gets covered in isolation. On one flank, the Gulf states most exposed to this war are building new security arrangements specifically because they've concluded American protection isn't something to bet everything on. On the other flank, America's oldest and most institutionally bound allies in Europe are declining, as a bloc, to share the military burden of a war Washington started without meaningfully consulting them. Two different regions, two different sets of allies, reaching a broadly similar conclusion through entirely different reasoning, that this particular American war is not automatically their war, and that the old assumption, where Washington leads and allies fall in line, no longer holds as reliably as it once did. It's worth being fair to the counter-argument here because there's a real one. A defense pact signed on paper is not the same as an integrated command structure, joint exercises, or interoperable forces. The Mecca agreement, at least as publicly described, commits its signatories to treating an attack on one as an attack on all, but stops well short of the institutional depth NATO built over 7 decades. Turkish officials went out of their way to describe the agreement as not aimed at any specific country, which is the kind of hedge governments use when they want deterrent value without inviting open confrontation with anyone, including Washington. And Europe's refusal to send ships to Hormuz isn't the same as Europe abandoning the broader transatlantic relationship. The same European governments that said no to Hormuz have continued substantial military and financial support for Ukraine, arguably the conflict most central to their own security. Allied caution about one specific unpopular war is not proof that alliance structures are collapsing wholesale. What that counter-argument has more difficulty explaining is the direction and speed of the trend. The Saudi-Pakistan Pact that seeded the Mecca agreement was signed in September 2025, before this war even began, explicitly in response to an Israeli strike on a fellow Gulf state that left regional governments questioning whether they could rely on existing security guarantees. Turkey's interest in joining predates the war too, and was reported at the time as being driven partly by doubts about American reliability under the current administration. The European refusal on Hormuz came within the war's first month, not after some later provocation. It was the immediate, reflexive answer the first time Washington asked European militaries to physically share risk in a conflict they hadn't chosen. None of these are one-off reactions to a single bad month. They're the visible edge of a reassessment that multiple sets of American partners appear to have been making independently, for overlapping but distinct reasons, over a period of nearly a year. There's a genuine question underneath all of this that's bigger than any single alliance document. What actually holds a security relationship together once the guaranteeing power's own capacity looks less certain than it used to? For most of the post-Cold War period, American alliance commitments carried weight, partly because the underlying military capacity backing them was rarely in serious doubt. A Gulf state or a European government could disagree with a specific American policy while still trusting that the security guarantee itself was solid. What's different about this moment is that the disagreement and the capacity question are arriving at the same time. Allies are questioning specific American choices in this war, precisely as reporting on interceptor stockpiles and munitions production raises real questions about how much slack the underlying military machine actually has left to give. Those two doubts feed each other. A government confident in Washington's capacity might tolerate disagreement over strategy. A government uncertain about that capacity has a much stronger incentive to start building its own redundancy, on its own timeline, regardless of how any individual negotiation over the Strait of Hormuz eventually resolves. None of this means the American alliance system is finished, and it would be a mistake to read either the Mecca Pact or the European Hormuz refusal as a clean, decisive break. Alliances built over decades don't dissolve because of one war, however costly. But both events are real, both are documented, and both point in the same direction. American partners in two different regions, facing two different sets of pressures, choosing in 2026 to hedge rather than simply wait for Washington to sort out a war that started without their input and that has strained the very capacity, missiles, interceptors, political bandwidth that their own security has long depended on. Whether that hedging becomes a permanent feature of how the Gulf and Europe relate to American power or fades once this particular war ends is the actual question worth tracking in the months ahead. Not through the next headline out of Air Force One, but through whether the Mecca Pact gains joint exercises and real institutional depth, and whether Europe's Aspides mission stays confined to the Red Sea or eventually gets pulled, reluctantly, into the Gulf after all.